And I think there are truths within vegan diets and truths within vegetarian diets. And people who find improvements in health with a vegan or vegetarian diet, they've found a truth. And when my eczema and asthma got better with a carnivore diet, I found a little bit of a truth, right? But I didn't find the whole truth.
Let's start this conversation off talking about something that if we zoom out and take a look at this subject matter and we think about through the years, like we're having a turn towards more natural food, right? Whole foods, real foods, there's this movement, but at the same time, there's this parallel universe of more and more artificial, right? And one of those being the big one, artificial sweeteners. And as soon as I hear that label, my cognitive bias is like, maybe this is a problem, but at the same time, a lot of folks who are in the health space are like, this is totally fine. This is my thing. And just to provide some informed consent, let's talk a little bit about artificial sweeteners.
Yeah, I think that there is some intuition that humans have with regard to these things. Like your antennas going up saying, maybe this isn't something good. But it's important to consider the science and ask, what does the science really suggest? And what do we know about artificial sweeteners? I believe there are some larger meta-analyses suggesting that they are weight neutral or perhaps not harmful in terms of weight. But when people in the health space suggest that artificial sweeteners are benign, I kind of scratch my head and think, how are they ignoring multiple regions of research on artificial sweeteners suggesting that they're maybe not so benign for humans? So let's start with like probably the worst set of artificial sweeteners, the most artificial of the artificial sweeteners, the non-caloric sweeteners like sucralose, which is Splenda, ACE-K, which is Asulfame K, aspartame. Those are the biggest ones today, those big three. So ACE-K, Splenda, sucralose, and aspartame. And there's good evidence that all three of those change the gut microbiome. They disrupt the way that the bacteria in the gut talk to each other, which is called quorum sensing. So that doesn't sound like a good thing to me. That doesn't sound like something we want to do. But even going deeper than that, there's research by a psychologist out of, I think she's in Yale and maybe a Canadian university, Dana Small, I think is her name. And she did a study with sucralose, which is Splenda. And they didn't even intend the study to show this. It was sort of an accident of a study. But they had multiple different sets of drinks. But one of the drinks had sucralose, about 30 grams of sucralose with about 30 grams of, maybe less than that in terms of the maltodextrin, maybe 20 grams of maltodextrin and 30 grams of sucralose. And when they gave people this drink, 7 drinks of sucralose plus a carbohydrate, maltodextrin, which is a glucose polysaccharide, over 2 weeks, 7 drinks over 2 weeks, they had changes in a negative way in their insulin response, meaning that their insulin was hyper-responding. 7 drinks over 2 weeks changed people's insulin response, changed people's glucose response in humans, and especially in adolescents. So they had an arm of the study that was 13 to 17-year-olds. And they had to stop that arm early because the kids became so insulin resistant so fast. They had to shut it down. Like, that's horrible. And you think, okay, how many products are there in any grocery store that have Splenda and a carbohydrate together? The last estimate I saw was over 3,000. And how many of those are eaten by some teenager or adult who thinks that a reduced calorie cranberry juice is a good thing? It's always reduced calorie foods, right? So it's going to be a reduced calorie food that's going to have carbohydrates that your body is used to seeing, glucose, fructose, sucrose, things like this in these foods naturally occurring. So there's so many foods in any grocery store that are going to have some carbohydrate plus sucralose. And there's good evidence now that this is confusing the body. The body's essentially seeing or perceiving at the level of the gut and then the vagus nerve in the brain a level of sweetness that is not matched by the calories that are coming with that. So the neurometabolic connection between the gut and the brain gets disordered. And yet we're generally telling people that artificial sweeteners are good because they're less calories, and less calories allows you to lose weight, which is kind of crazy. So I suspect that if we did the same study with ACE-K or aspartame, you would probably see the same results in terms of neurometabolic derangements, disordered insulin signaling when people are doing the sweeteners with carbohydrates. Now, to be fair to the study, they had an arm where it was just sucralose and it didn't have the same effect. But how often does someone just drink a Diet Coke with nothing else? How often does a kid just drink a Diet Coke or a Diet Monster or a Red Bull? That's going to, all of these like diet drinks that say they tout the fact that they have no sugar. They celebrate the fact that they have no sugar, which probably is a good thing that they don't have processed sugar, but what are they putting instead? Some artificial sweetener, usually sucralose, Splenda, Ace K, aspartame in there. And so these are almost always consumed with some sort of food, which is going to have carbohydrates in them. So if you just gave someone these artificial sweeteners without any carbohydrates, you might not have the same neurometabolic derangements. You're going to have the same gut effects in terms of quorum sensing, changing bacterial populations, but you may not get the same neurometabolic effects. But I think that the majority of people are going to consume non-nutritive, that is non-caloric or very low caloric sweeteners like Splenda, sucralose with other foods. And they're trying to lose weight if they're doing this, and they're probably going backwards, right? They're probably doing themselves harm in terms of insulin signaling. And then you have a separate set of sweeteners, which people think are benign. Whenever I talk about artificial sweeteners, the questions I always get are, what about what about stevia? And what about monk fruit? So that the ones that are supposedly natural. But unfortunately, stevia also changes the gut flora. We know that pretty clearly. There are studies in animal models with mice that show decreased fertility or impairment of fertility when they give stevia. And stevia, historically, from anthropology, has also been used by indigenous people to affect fertility, to prevent pregnancy. So stevia might not be as benign as we believe it to be. So again, and then you think monk fruit, there can't be anything wrong with monk fruit, right? Well, I don't think many people understand what monk fruit sweetener actually is. The fact that it's a fruit in the labeling is misleading because monk fruit contains fructose, right? Glucose, sucrose, like any fruit does. But to make monk fruit sweetener, they extract a part of the monk fruit, which is extra sweet. They're called mogrosides. And there are 5 mogroside compounds that they extract and they concentrate. So if you eat a monk fruit, 1% of the sugars of the compounds in that monk fruit are mogrosides. But to make monk fruit sweetener, they're extracting that and concentrating it. So monk fruit sweetener is concentrated super high levels of these mogrosides. So you're not just getting ground up monk fruit and people are saying, oh, ground up monk fruit, right? It's fine, it's benign, no calories. No, you're taking one compound in monk fruit that's extra sweet, that doesn't have nutritive calories, quote unquote, like a glucose or a fructose molecule. And then we don't fully understand what those mogrosides do in the human body at those high levels. There is evidence that they could be problematic in terms of gut flora. And actually, before this podcast, I was looking at a study showing that they do change the gut flora. So when you have these mogrosides, it's changing the gut flora, it's changing the way bacteria in the gut are metabolizing compounds too. So I'm not even convinced that monk fruit sweetener is benign for humans. So then people say, what should I do? And we can talk about that. I just don't know why people wouldn't do what we've done for 450,000 years as humans, which is if you want something sweet, get some raw honey, preferably from a farm that's not around a bunch of plants that are sprayed glyphosate, or eat some fruit, or have some fruit juice that you made yourself. I mean, I think that we can get into this if you want, but I don't think that having some sweet foods like fruit juice, raw organic honey in your life is problematic for humans if they're in reasonable quantities, perhaps scaled to your activity levels. And yet I think people believe that that's going to lead to more weight gain than an artificial sweetener. But if we consider all this metabolic research and all the gut derangements, the question we really need to be asking and educating people on is, this could be even worse trying the artificial sweeteners. Why not just do the honey and your body will thank you for it? And I think most people would be fine.
Absolutely. We got studies affirming how honey, obviously it's a sweet substance, but it improves fasting blood glucose.
Have you seen the study with diabetics? Yeah.
Bananas. And by the way, I want to mention this too, just to circle back on this, because you just really brought out, this is so important because again, we tend to have tunnel vision when it comes to something that we're using or that we like. And so the jury is out on things like stevia and monk fruit, but at the same time, we're looking at, oh, this is more natural. But anything that's concentrated where they're turning it into this like crystalline powder, whatever, we should have our red flags come up. Now, with that said, going back to the artificial sweeteners, there's this particular study, which I don't think a lot of folks have gotten a chance to see this yet. And it's just one of those things where it's just like, I knew it was a matter of time because our biology is wired up a certain way. You mentioned something where we have this post-ingestive feedback, right? We eat a thing, we evolved eating a thing and getting data back. Like the calories and or the energy, it's the food itself is matching a certain profile. And so now we're getting this sweet input, but it's just like the body's like, what is going on here? And we think we could just trick our bodies and not have any side effects. And so this was published by the American Diabetes Society. And this was on test subjects who didn't regularly consume artificial sweeteners. This was 17 test subjects. And they found that the artificial sweetener sucralose elevated their blood sugar levels 14%. It directly elevated their blood sugar levels. It's not supposed to do that. And their insulin levels, as you talked about a little bit earlier, they elevated their insulin levels by 20% on average. All right, again, artificial sweeteners, we could think they're pretending to be sweet, but we're not getting any of these kind of side effects. But the reality is very different.
And the mogrosides from monk fruit also raise insulin in humans. So it's just, you think you're just confusing your body.
So you just brought into the fold, mentioning honey, mentioning fruit, things that we evolved eating as a species, but people might be surprised to hear that coming from Carnivore MD.
Yeah.
Can you explain yourself?
Yeah. So I've always found it humbling to be a doctor, to be a physician, to be someone in the health field, because we're always learning, right? And I love that I'm always learning. And my carnivore, quote, journey started maybe 5 years ago. I think when we first did this podcast, I was probably strictly carnivore. I remember sitting in the old studio and I probably was only eating meat and organs and animal fat and salt. That's all I ate for a year and a half. And then I ran into some problematic side effects, electrolyte issues, some hormonal changes. My testosterone was dropping. I was getting heart palpitations, probably related to the electrolyte issues. At a technical level, if you looked at my blood work, my sex hormone binding globulin was going up, which means that your free androgens and other free hormones are going down, which isn't really what you want. And I was living in San Diego at the time, and I kind of always felt cold. San Diego is kind of that cold culture, like just the cold environment. But I always felt colder than I thought I should be. And if you look at my thyroid labs, my free T3 and free T4 were just kind of getting low and like right on that low end of normal, but the TSH isn't moving. There's probably some degree of thyroid derangement that happens with long-term ketogenic diets. And so this is what I realized. And I added back fruit. I added back honey first, then fruit. And so many of these issues I had got better. And you can see this on my podcast, which is called Fundamental Health. I've gone to great lengths to show people my labs. I love as Tim Ferriss says, the opening of the kimono. Like I show people my blood work. And while I'm in LA now, I'm going to get another set of blood work. So I did a podcast in August with blood work, podcast in November with blood work. I think I did a June podcast in 2022 with blood work. And you can see in that stuff, like my testosterone goes up, my thyroid labs go up, the electrolytes normalize, the sex hormone binding globulin comes down. Subjectively sleeping better, don't have cramps in my muscles. I can go to a climbing wall and actually climb and not have a cramp in my calf when I'm pointing my foot to a hold. I remember at some points in my sort of carnivore experimentation with a fully ketogenic diet, I would flex my forearm and I would get a cramp in my forearm. A lot of people get cramps in their calves. Yeah. I would get forearm cramps. Oh, this is not right. And so what I learned that I was never taught in medical school, and I feel very humbled by this, is that insulin is not the enemy. And postprandial, after eating, so after a meal, your insulin goes up. And I think that for some unfortunate reason in the low carb community, I think a lot of people are very intelligent and well-intentioned, but they don't understand that that's a positive thing. And I never learned in medical school that insulin has like essentially non-replaceable actions at the level of the kidney to hold on to electrolytes. So if you are always eating keto, your insulin's always low, which is sort of good, but your insulin's always low. You're never getting a postprandial insulin bump, and your kidney is never getting a signal to hold on to calcium, to hold on to magnesium, to hold on potassium or calcium. And so you're getting all these issues that are related to all the electrolytes being out of whack. Because if your sodium goes low, your body's going to switch it for potassium to hold on to sodium. And then if your magnesium or your calcium goes low, your body has all these antiporters and symporters in the kidney where you're absorbing electrolytes together and in opposition. So you're going to switch things out. It's like you're playing Uno or something and you're trading cards because you need a little more of this electrolyte. You have to sacrifice that electrolyte. And I've seen so many people on long-term ketogenic diets who were really working hard to lose weight and become healthier, who had recalcitrant electrolyte issues that were unsolvable with massive amounts of sodium. And so what I learned was, hey, carbohydrates essential for the human body. There's sort of this signal of abundance for the human body, and that makes sense evolutionarily. When carbohydrates are available, the environment that you are in as a human, as a male or a female, is saying, this is abundance, celebrate this. And if you're living near the equator, those carbohydrates are probably around more of the year. I mean, where I live near the equator now, there's fruit year round, there's honey year round because bees are doing their things year round. And so that's a very fertile place for humans to be, but carbohydrates are a signal of abundance for us. When we pull them away, we're giving our body this winter signal. And some people might argue, oh, it's good to have a winter signal every once in a while, and that's a whole separate debate. But to give a winter signal consistently or all the time leads to some pretty massive problems for human physiology. And though I think that intentional dietary choices like keto are generally to be appreciated, I think that they're being overused and a lot of people are suffering, and there's not a lot of discussion about the real, like, non-trivial downsides to not having carbohydrates in your diet. So now my diet is, the word carnivore is getting very flexible these days. So I thought maybe the words animal-based would be better in contradistinction to plant-based. Mostly my diet is animal foods. I eat meat, I eat organs, I have raw butter, I have raw dairy, raw milk, raw cheese, raw cream. I got some raw kefir here. And then to that, I will add carbohydrates in the form of honey, usually raw, organic, glyphosate-free honey, and fruit or fruit juice. And those are kind of titrated based on activity level for me. And it's made a world of difference. And there's still things that I leave out, and we can talk about this if you want. The vegetables are left out. So I'm not eating all plant foods, and that's from this sort of broader perspective and framework of what are the least toxic plant foods. You know, if you want to be a healthy human, if you really want to thrive as a human, the equation that I think of is how do you get the most nutrients, micronutrients being especially important, something we don't think about a lot, like the vitamins and the minerals, to make the little biochemical wheels and gears and levers in our bodies go with the least amount of toxins. So you're always going to get a little bit of toxin. You're always going to get some environmental pollution. You're driving on the road. There's contaminants in our water. No matter what we do, there's always going to be pesticides on our food. You're always going to get a little bit of plant defense chemicals in your food. But how do you get the least amount of those toxins to allow you to thrive most as a human? And I think it makes sense from, again, going back to that evolutionary lens. What are the most sought after foods by humans? It's not vegetables. You go to visit the Hadza. So I went to Tanzania a few years ago. They don't really celebrate vegetables. I did not see them eat a single vegetable. I went digging tubers with the women, but the guys that were there with me, the Hadza men, were like, we don't want that stuff. We want to eat honey. If we find some berries, we'll eat it. And really, we want to go hunt for animals and eat them from nose to tail with all their organs. So there's a very clear pattern. And anthropologists who have done their PhDs with the Hadza or the Khoisan in Southern Africa and Botswana and Namibia say the same things. Like, these people, they crave either sweet foods or animal foods. So they don't really celebrate vegetables. They might eat, quote, vegetables. And by vegetables, I'm thinking of things like leaves, stems, roots, and seeds of plants. If they're starving, those allow us to be that sort of fully omnivorous human, but they're not really sought after by humans. They're very low on the totem pole. And that makes sense, right? But the Hadza will not turn the blind eye to honey. When I was on a hunt with them, they found a beehive in a tree, and those guys were up in the tree making a fire with sticks in under 2 minutes. The sticks that they just cut off branches from a nearby tree. They had a fire with no lighter, no matches in under 2 minutes. They're smoking the bees out, and then they're handing these huge pieces of honeycomb down to us. And the next thing I know, I'm eating bug larvae. I'm eating bee larvae with honey dripping off of it. And we're all just really excited because they just had a kill. We were hunting baboons at the time. So they'd killed a baboon and we had honey, and it was one of the best days in a long time for them, probably.
Wow, man. The biggest thing here for me, number one, is you are a model of what we all should aspire towards, which is being a student. This is the thing about you that I don't think a lot of people really get. Like, you as a human being, it should be evolution. It should be paying attention to my body and making adjustments as I go along, and not to be dogmatic about things, and again, there's still, because I think we could, have our biases, there's still this openness to you to where this could be this could be, the jury's still out, but you're sharing the data that we have. But I respect that so much, that you're because the reason that you went into the carnivore protocol, it helped you to get well, and it helped a lot of patients that you were working with. And that's the thing about it, that I think whether it's on the other end of the spectrum, if you got a vegan physician doing this protocol, it probably helped him or her and or their patients at some point. But once we have this kind of end all be all, this is right for everybody right now, that's the problem. And so with you evolving your perspective and taking people along with you, like when you start to share, these were my numbers, this is what was going on, like I was just like, amazing. That is so amazing, because that's what we all have the potential to do. But we can't make those adjustments when we live in this dogmatic frame. And so what we'll try to do inside of it is just like, I'm just going to keto harder, right? Or I'm just going to, I need to cut out more, whatever the thing might be within that framework, instead of opening yourself up like, and with this bias, which I think is a healthy bias, what have humans been doing the longest? I think that part of our problem right now as a society, especially when we become interested in health, is we have all of this infighting over minutia. And instead of looking at the big picture, like the majority of our citizens are eating ultra processed foods, like that's the majority of our diet. And so getting into this space where we are working on being a healthier, happier version of ourselves, but also giving ourselves permission to have diversity within that, to have healthy conversations with that, and being open to change.
Yeah, I feel like I'm doing the best when I'm making people curious. I want someone to be curious. I don't want to be dogmatic with what I'm doing. I've evolved in my thinking and with what I do. And if I can help someone think for themselves and do their own research, that's my goal. And even within the bounds and the framework that I'm suggesting people consider now, an animal-based diet of organs, meat, fruit, honey, and raw dairy, maybe the most nutrient-rich foods that are least toxic, I do try and frame it in a perspective that says, if you're thriving, don't change a thing. If you want to eat some kale or some broccoli or some spinach, great. It's not a big deal if you're doing great. What's really important for me is that somebody who is suffering, who is having eczema, psoriasis, mental health issues, GI issues, obesity, sleep issues, and not finding a solution, might find what I'm doing and think, oh, maybe that's the piece I was missing, right? Maybe that kale is not great for me. Maybe the spinach has too many oxalates and that's why I have joint issues, or that's why I have some arthritis. Maybe these mega doses of quote unquote medicinal mushrooms like chaga and reishi are actually triggering my eczema because they're over triggering my immune system. Or maybe this stevia or maybe these artificial sweeteners are making me a little hungry. That's what I want people to do, is to think for themselves and be curious. I think that in the health space, when people see me talking about an animal-based diet, they think I'm admonishing them. This is what you should eat, with a wagging finger. And that's not it at all. It's just saying, hey, this has worked for me. I've seen a lot of people who were previously kind of stuck with all these autoimmune issues or chronic health issues get better when they cut out foods that we widely consider to be healthy, or that we're told are benign, like artificial sweeteners, or foods that we didn't even know were bad for us, like seed oils. And that's what I want people to kind of just get, that little red pill, from the Matrix metaphor. Like, I just want to make people a little curious and to think for themselves. But I do not want people to take what I say at face value. I want them to examine it, to disregard it if they don't find it to be valuable, to do their own research, and hopefully, kind of like we were talking about before the podcast, find ways to create healthy discourse between people with slightly different ideas, because there is just all this infighting and dogmatism, and people just get religious and they choose a camp. And then it's hard there's not really even fertile soil anymore to plant seeds and people to kind of think about how their ideas might be evolving and growing. So curiosity is the coolest thing for me. If I can create that in people, then we're doing good. We're trying. Yeah.
Part of that, it's a natural evolution into being dogmatic about a thing, or just making it like, this is the end all be all. This way is the way, when we get results with a thing, right? Especially if we've been in pain for years or struggling with a certain thing, and we change something within a diet framework, then that becomes the holy everything, right? And of course, again, we have to be more understanding on what brought people to that place. And we are at an interesting place today where previously humans were driven by the necessity of survival, right? And doing what they had to do within the environment. And also, cultures previously often had a lot of respect for our place in this whole web, of life here on planet Earth, which has kind of had this weird separation cognitively, but we're still on the planet, so we're not really separate. But today, instead of really going off of what we're designed to eat and or the foods that we've eaten historically, now we can eat idealistically, right? Now we can eat based on a belief or a bias, right? And that is I think it's a wonderful evolution to be able to think in those terms, but evolution takes time. And so when we start to like live by this idealistic thing, and then we're suffering, hurting ourselves and trying to operate within this idealistic framework, this is a, part and parcel of like so much of the struggle that I think we're having here, not being able to have these healthier conversations.
Have you ever read The Prophet by Khalil Gibran?
I can't say that I have.
It's this awesome book. It's mostly poetry, but I'm reminded of this line in The Prophet, and I'm paraphrasing him, but he says, "Don't say I've found the truth, say I have found a truth." And I'm thinking about this as you're describing all these different ways that people are trying to become healthy. And I think there are truths within vegan diets and truths within vegetarian diets. And people who find improvements in health with a vegan or vegetarian diet, they've found a truth. And when my eczema and asthma got better with a carnivore diet, I found a little bit of a truth, right? But I didn't find the whole truth. And that's what I think we're getting to here is I think we're in the process, or like the journey of life is about finding truths and never really believing that we've found an entirety of the truth. So it's an evolution, right? And I think that there's value in vegan diets. There's value in vegetarian diets. What did those people cut out that led to their improvements? But is it the whole truth? No, let's not become dogmatic and say this is the only way. Let's just say there's a truth here, and how do we put that together for other people? So that's what I was thinking when you were talking about this, because there's a lot of truths, and there's truths from people who think about things completely differently than me.
Yeah. And
they get lost when we get too dogmatic.
And this is what's so amazing about our species as well, is that we're so diverse, and we're so diverse. I have this belief that humans have literally just tried to eat everything. And if you think about it, like babies, like they just go and put stuff in their mouth, and other species, they go and lick and sniff and all this stuff. But again, we're so evolved and we're so above these things. But in reality, humans have tried to nibble on everything from like bat dung to like, beetles and whatever, oysters, whatever. This whole spectrum. I don't know how I got from bat dung to oysters, but we've experimented. And the thing is, our ancestors figured a lot of stuff out, through trial and error, trial and success, and kind of laid out a blueprint for us. But we can still see that blueprint in the evolution of our brain as a species, even if so much of our history has been lost and, burned and, whatever has happened along the way. But if we can lean on to that, and this is what one of the other things I admire about you is, let me actually go and involve myself in a culture that has a lineage, right, that are still living in the ways that our ancestors evolved in as primarily hunters, but having gathering aspects in their community as well. And you going there and having the experience and paying attention, and again, being open, like, oh, wow, they're doing this thing, they're doing that, and adding that to your repertoire, seeing if it works for you, because we have these growing fields, we have nutrigenomics, nutrigenetics, and our genetics, we do have certain things that interact with our template right now. But even that can change. And that's another thing about this whole genetic conversation.
Yeah, I think that people shouldn't overcomplicate it, right? Understand, try and find some baseline where you feel good, know what feels good to you, and then make some experiments and see if you feel better or worse from there. But it goes back to what I was saying earlier, and I think people get lost because there's so much conflicting health information today. There's another guy or girl saying kale's the best thing on the earth, and there's a bean diet, spinach is amazing, and celery juicing, right? And I'm gonna say, oh, celery's got these psoralins which can accumulate in the skin and cross-link DNA and might create photosensitivity, and spinach is full of oxalates, so if you've got issues, maybe So what I want people to think about, or what I would suggest they think about, is just how do you get the most nutrients with the least amount of toxins, and then understand what your baseline is so you can feel as good as possible, and then kind of, navigate yourself, because there's definitely bio-individuality and differences between humans in terms of what foods are really going to allow us to feel the best. But that's the goal, for humans to thrive. That's the goal. And like you said, I think if we get too dogmatic, we get stuck, and then we're calcified. We're sort of ossified, like petrified wood, and we're like, this is all you're ever going to get. That's the best you're ever going to get, but there could be so much more that we're leaving on the table.
Yeah, yeah, and that's what, for me, I would love to see the journey be about. Like, how good can it get?
Yeah, how good can it get?
But right now, we also have a large part of our population that's still in struggle and trying to, survive, even though they have a lot of stuff they're eating, but their bodies are really starving. And just to lean back into this portion, which is, again, you going on these adventures and putting yourself in these really interesting places of analysis, you have another recent Indiana Jones type of experience, and as of this recording right now, there's another Indiana Jones coming, if people don't know that. Shout out to Harrison Ford. Maybe he's doing
Is he making more movies or something?
Maybe he's.
He's doing another Indiana Jones movie.
We got to study him. All right, we got to study him. But can you talk a little bit about this, because you happened upon some fascinating historical context for a certain category of foods?
Yeah, this is pretty amazing, and it does find congruence with what I've seen in hunter-gatherer cultures, which is when I hunted the baboons with the Hadza, the first thing we did was eat the organs. The first thing. So first of all, people might say, oh my God, you hunted baboons, but this is their life. This is their lifeblood. This is what they do. They hunt baboons. But with every animal that we hunted and they hunted, whether it was a genet cat or a baboon were probably the bigger ones, or a dik-dik, which is like a small ruminant, like a really, really tiny deer, the first thing they do is eat the organs. And before I started thinking about a carnivore diet, before I started thinking about animal foods, I never really had organs. I had a little bit of liverwurst growing up, but I never ate heart until about 5 years ago. I never ate thymus until about 3 years ago. I never ate intestines. I never ate brain. I ate brain with the Hadza. So when we killed this baboon, the next day, the hunter whose arrow struck the final blow to the baboon hands me like the skull of a baboon that this is like treasured brain. This is true Indiana Jones stuff, man. Like Temple of Doom when he's eating the monkey brains. But I literally ate baboon brains with this Hadza guy, and they love it. They love the brain. And for a while, I've had this intuition that organs have to be a uniquely valuable food for humans. You go to Whole Foods, you go to any grocery store, Trader Joe's, Sprouts, whatever, you're going to see meat. But how often do you see heart or thymus or liver or kidney or spleen or brain? Almost never for most of those organs. Testicle, ovaries, uterus, fallopian tubes. None of these organs are at the grocery store. So we've just forgotten about them. They're just gone. They're essentially shadow banned from our existence because people won't eat them anymore. And I get it. A lot of these organs are different tastes than we've grown up with. Unless you grew up in a very ethnic family that was making soups out of these things, you may not have a taste for liver, and you probably have never had thymus or spleen in your life because different textures and stuff. But our ancestors have always eaten these foods. So I kind of knew like there's got to be something unique about these foods. They're not just eating it because of the calories, because they'll give some foods to the dogs. So they give the intestines to the dogs that are full of the poop. They're going to give that to the dogs. They won't eat things they don't like the taste of. They're not going to eat bitter leaves unless they're starving. So if they didn't like the taste of the organs, they would just get rid of them. They would give them to the dogs. But they find some value there. And this has always been true. There's never been a culture of hunter-gatherers, or really a historical culture of humans that's been studied, that doesn't eat the organs and usually eat them first and celebrate them. There are some cultures in Africa that won't even touch liver with their hands because it's so sacred. Like liver is almost worshipped by these people. So what is going on here? And you can start to look, and I started to dig, and you see, okay, at one level, liver, for instance, super nutritious. Liver is quote unquote nature's multivitamin. You got choline, you got vitamin A that's bioavailable in the retinol form. You got biotin, you got folate, you got riboflavin, you got selenium, you got manganese, you got magnesium, you got zinc, you got copper. But there's a whole different level to these organs that I'd always suspected was there, and we recently found some really fascinating evidence of this. It's basically medical research that's been done over the last 70 to 80 years that nobody really knows about, which is why it's kind of the Indiana Jones stuff. There are some papers that are published in journals that you can search on PubMed. There's papers with thymogulin, which is a peptide. These are short proteins, usually less than 10 amino acids, but sometimes a little greater than 10 amino acids. Peptides in these organs that don't occur in other meats or parts of the animal that have unique functions in humans. So there's double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trials with thymogulin from thymus, which is an organ that sits behind the sternum in humans, that show that if you give this to kids, they get less respiratory tract infections. And if you give it to elderly people, they also get less colds, flus, respiratory tract infections. So here you have an immune organ. The thymus is where the T cells of our body go to mature and get programmed. But the teaching I got in medical school is that the thymus involutes, that it shrinks as you age. But in animal studies, we've never done this in humans, but in animal studies, if you give them thymus extract, if you give the animals thymus, their thymus grows. And they are more resistant to infections, both bacterial and viral. So that's really cool. We're just coming out of, a huge pandemic. People are worried about immunity, flu season. Nobody wants to be sick. But have you ever heard someone say, maybe take some thymus, it's flu season? Never. They might take vitamin C or echinacea, but the data for thymus is more robust than either of those. And we've never heard about it. And there's data mostly from Germany in the 1950s and 1960s of giving almost all of the organs to animals and then seeing the corresponding organ grow. So you can give, this is what's really cool. You can give the animals like a liver, or you can put liver pulp on a chicken embryo, and the chicken embryo's liver gets bigger. The spleen enlarges. If you give it spleen, heart enlarges. It's this concept that in an organ, there possibly could be growth factors, peptides that are supportive for the corresponding organ in humans. This concept of like supports like, and it's been talked about a little bit in the past. I remember Joe Rogan and Huberman talking about it on a podcast, and Joe says to Andrew, who's a friend of mine, is there any evidence for this? And Andrew goes, none that I'm aware of. And so I've been texting my friend Andrew, man, you got to show you this stuff, because there's actually really good evidence that when you eat an organ, it does have unique growth factors that are not present in other organs, not present in muscle meat, that could support the corresponding organ. That's wild. And so to find these studies, this is what's one of the cooler parts. We had to go down these rabbit holes. This is my team at Heart and Soil. Had to go down these rabbit holes, and we found this book in the library in Heidelberg, Germany. And it's a book that's in German. And this book has never been digitized. You cannot search for this on the internet. It's a book in Germany, in a library. And so we had somebody go to Germany and the book has never been checked out of the library. Nobody's ever read this book, and it's German studies. And so what we did was we got the book and we had someone translate the studies from German. And what you find is that people have been talking about this for almost 100 years, that giving an organ to an animal, even a desiccated or like a freeze-dried organ, will support the corresponding organ, will either increase the mitoses, the cell divisions of the organ, will change the way immune cells work in the organ. It's a wild thing. And then you think, okay, these organs have been completely left out of the human diet. Maybe we're missing something big here. And that's what's really cool. So part of what I do is a huge advocacy for eating organs. One of my main missions for today is to figure out where I can find some liver and some heart in Los Angeles. But I want people to understand that these organs are powerful, and that getting them in their diet will be it's just extra credit. It's just free life points in your organism. You're going to feel better. And there's evidence with brain extracts, phosphatidylserine from brain of cows, that improves cognitive decline in the elderly. So those are actually widely published studies. That's another double-blind, placebo-controlled randomized study. So it's a really cool thing, man. And one of the things that I did in the last few years that I'm really proud of is build a company called Heart and Soil that makes these organs in desiccated form. So we freeze dry the organs and put them into capsules. If people can't or won't eat the organs, you can get them in capsules. I want people to eat the organs fresh, but I haven't seen thymus at Whole Foods anytime recently. And it's delicious, and it supports the immune system, brain, heart, liver, kidney, spleen, whatever. It's really cool stuff.
Can you let people know where they can find it?
Yeah, Heart and Soil. It's heartandsoil.co is the website, and people can go there. But I want you first to go to your local butcher and ask them if they have testicle or heart or liver or spleen, and eat these things. And if people won't do it, check out the desiccated organs. And like I said, there's also, and this is probably, from a perspective of reaching more people, this is one of the more exciting things, is that there's evidence from these studies in the 1960s in Germany that the freeze-dried extracts of these retain these tonic compounds, retain these tonic properties. If you take the organ, and they did this, and you boil it in a heat bath, it loses these things. But freeze-drying is pressure that's very low. So basically you put this in a special machine called a freeze-drying machine, and based on Laplace's law in physics, if you have a very low pressure, you can dehydrate something basically in the freezer of your house. So it's not like a dehydrator you have in your house that's 140 degrees. You're cooking the organ and getting the water out. You're putting the organ in a freezer that lowers the pressure, and that allows you to hit the triple point and sublimate the water from basically directly into basically it's a solid, and then it becomes a gas immediately. So you get rid of the water at a low temperature. It's how they make space food, but it preserves more nutrients.
I just had an image of the Jetsons.
Yeah.
Do you remember he used to you could push a button and a meal pops out,
Yeah.
Is that kind of consciousness, but we can use innovation for things that are still tied to what our bodies are really designed to have.
Yeah,
You
I
know?
don't even think of what we do at Heart and Soil as supplements. Technically, they're supplements, but they're just food in the capsule, and we make the food in the capsule in the best way we know how.
So, just to go back to this association, like having that resonance with like, and, the same thing can be said with, the doctrine of signatures and
Right.
certain things in nature having this resonance, with blueberries and the anthocyanins and vision and that kind of stuff. And, again, we might think that we don't have a map or some kind of guidance or instruction in the world around us about what human foods are, but the data's there. We've got the scientific, published data now, but also there's an intelligence. And staying in touch with, cultures that are still tied to that is really helpful. Because again, I think it's going to be jarring for some people to hear, like, they're out here, eating a baboon brain, you know what I mean? Like, that's a far jump from, Impossible Burger, you know what I mean? And so, but we have Impossible Burger consciousness on some folks right now. And here's the thing, it exists, and there might be, this is where I'm at. Even though I know that this is a plethora of processed garbage, I have to be open to the fact that this might actually create some kind of positive mutation where, maybe we can see into the future or something. Like, it's highly unlikely, but it's just being open to the possibility
Sure.
of being wrong and being aware of my bias, which my bias is towards what have humans been doing the longest that got us here to a
Right.
place where we have such robust health. And now to see this rapid decline, because that's one of the things I'm sure that people have said to you, like, even though humans were eating that way, back in the day, and then agriculture came along, we're living longer now, Paul. What do you say to that?
This is really important to talk about. So if you look at these anthropology studies, Frank Marlowe did a bunch with the Hadza, and there's other authors that have worked with like the Khoisan in Africa. These are the two that I'm most familiar with. So this question's been answered. If hunter-gatherers like the Khoisan in Namibia or the Hadza make it out of childhood, so they make it to 13 or 14 years old, they live as long as us. So it's really a fallacy to say they live shorter lives than us. But if you calculate it with infant mortality, their life expectancy is low because there's a high rate of infant mortality in these cultures. And it turns out that being a wild human living in the bush of Africa is kind of a dangerous thing, which is probably why humans had a lot of babies in the past. That's why other species make a lot of babies. Basically, during the reproductive years, many species are kind of they're constantly pregnant because very few of the children survive. Now, there are many downsides to the society we live in now, but one of the upsides is that we live in a safer world. There's not a poisonous snake crawling over to bite your kid. If your kid steps on that snake, it's going to die. There's not a cliff right there, or a cheetah, or a hyena that's going to come in and snatch your baby, or there's not, all kinds of dangerous things for kids to do that lead to high rates of infant mortality, and similarly rates of, death in childbirth for the mothers if there's infections or sanitation and things like this. So if you look at adult life, which is really what we're talking about here, because we're talking about chronic illness. Now, then they dwarf us in terms of longevity, in terms of health span. So they are longer, they're stronger and more vital for longer than we are. It's something called squaring of the morbidity curve, that if you looked at a 65-year-old Hadza male, he would dwarf us. He would crush the 65-year-old male Olympics. The Hadza is winning every day, in almost any feat across the population. Yeah. Women as well. Like a 65-year-old woman is going to be more vital, stronger, functional than a 65-year-old woman today. So that's what gets lost, is that their lifespan is the same, but their health span is greater than ours when you account for this high rate of infant mortality. And that's really what we're talking about, because again, it goes back to what kills most of us today. It's chronic illness. Very few of us are dying of infections today. So we've solved that problem, but in the process, we've created a bigger problem, which is obesity, metabolic dysfunction, diabetes, autoimmune conditions, GI conditions, depression, mental health illness, right? Those things are not really suffered by these hunter-gatherers, especially the Hadza, the Khoisan. They don't have these things. They're just not. There are no fat hunter-gatherers. And that, I think, is a great statement. And you could say, well, they don't have enough access to food to become obese, but I think they could eat a lot of the food they're eating and still not become obese. It's just, they would probably be a little more muscular, maybe a little taller 100,000 years ago, because they had much more access to food. Their hunting lands are being encroached upon by other more pastoralist cultures that are farming. So that it's true, the Hadza and probably the Khoisan in Namibia also, they don't have access to as much food as they would like. And they do have to supplement sometimes with things like cornmeal and even seed oils given to them by missionaries, unfortunately. But in general, I would say 80-90% of what they're eating is things they've hunted and gathered. So the closest thing we have to hunter-gatherers on the planet, and their health is exemplary, and they have a great longevity. So this idea that they live short lives is just false, and it's important to really clarify that.
That seed oil and cornmeal, it's the missionary position. They're putting them in the missionary position, man. Listen, so, again, just to expand our thinking and to really identify, like, this is what we really want, is to improve our health span.
Yeah.
It's not just our lifespan. We don't want to just have extended suffering, and we have this very idealistic view because of how things can get packaged up based on, still based on a bias. And it's not to say that this is negatively intended, but when we talk about centenarians or cultures that live a long time, it tends to be this very clean, clear cut, and these messages that often aren't really accurate are tied to them. For example, that they're largely plant-based communities. Now, this is not an advocation against a plant-based diet or against a carnivore diet. This is an important conversation. You said the O word earlier, all right? There's a lot of good O words out there, all right? But you said omnivore. And if we all just have a collective awareness, just basic awareness of ourselves in the place of, time, evolution, being a part of this planet, humans can eat every type of food. We are omnivorous. The question is, what are the best foods for us? And so when we go solely plant-based or solely animal-based, we're probably going to find ourselves lacking in certain things. Now, we can be creative and we can find out ways to supplement those things. But your most important avocation, you did this again, you even mentioned your supplement, but you were pointing back, hey, food first. Let's go food first, because the food has the stuff. But we have to be willing to experiment, and we have to be willing to open ourselves up and to, have these conversations as well. So I wanted to actually ask you about, being that this is the case, you just mentioned our skyrocketing rates of chronic disease here in this country. A lot of folks don't realize this, man, but this is what we do. Like, I'm staying on top of the data. The CDC published just their most recent numbers from last year. 60% of Americans now have at least one chronic disease, at least one. 40% have two or more, all right? We are a society today that the majority of us have chronic illnesses. We're not well. This is the majority of us. And that number is still trending upward, by the way. The question is, how do we get into a situation like that? How do we get into a situation where disease is normalized? And my question to you, and what I want you to talk about, is there's an obvious disconnect between what we're educated about, what we should be eating, and what our health outcomes are. These two things are not matching up in a beneficial way. So I want to talk about some of the corruption in food policy, in education.
Yeah. I want to talk about that, but I want to hit on a couple other points you made before we got there real quick. So omnivore is true for humans, but one of the things that I learned that I was never taught in pre-med or medical school is that within zoology, within the animal kingdoms, animals tend to be either plant-based or animal-based omnivores, meaning that 75% of omnivorous species either eat the majority, 70% of their food as animal foods or plant foods. So this idea of omnivore as like, I eat a little bit of everything, is not really true in the plant kingdom. Even within the plant kingdom, animals tend to go one way or the other. Primates are a good example. Chimps, bonobos, they're pretty much plant-based omnivores. They do eat meat when they're given meat. And this is a whole separate conversation that we probably won't talk about in this podcast, how we got from being, plant-based omnivores as chimps and bonobos to what I believe are animal-based omnivores today as humans. But there are plant-based omnivores and there are animal-based omnivores. Like a dog is an animal-based omnivore. Given its free reign as a wolf, it's going to eat most of its food as animal foods. And I think that looking at our history as humans, it's pretty clear we're now animal-based omnivores. You mentioned this a little bit earlier when you talked about the brain and the idea that the human brain gives us this history, this lineage. And you look at the size of the human brain, 2 million years ago, the human brain got way bigger. It went from about 600 cc's to 1,500 cc's in the span of 1.5 million years. After millions and millions of years of being the same size in our primate relatives, what happened? We don't know for sure, but a really compelling theory is we began to hunt more and eat more animals.
And cooking.
Cooking too, yeah. Although I think my suspicion is that it's mostly the animals rather than the cooking, but there's a compelling argument that's being made for the cooking as well. So something happened there. And did cooking allow us to eat more animal foods as well? So something happened in the human brain. And if you look at the nutrients that we need as humans, we don't do so well as plant-based omnivores. This is clear. We need so many nutrients that occur only in animal foods. Creatine, carnitine, choline, anserine, taurine, vitamin A in the retinol form. It's pretty clear. The blueprint is there. So I think that humans are animal-based omnivores, eat some plant foods, but still remember animal foods, meat, organs, either fresh or desiccated, dairy, if you tolerate it. That's a whole separate interesting conversation. These are where we get the most of our nutrients. And then they have very low toxins. And then within the plant kingdom, the curiosity that I want to challenge people with is, are there less toxic plant foods? The other thing you mentioned were the blue zones. So there's a whole podcast I've done on the blue zones, probably 2 or 3 on the blue zones. Just wanted to bookmark for a second, or just pin the fact that if you look at the blue zones, there's 5 technically blue zones. 4 of the 5 have large amounts of meat consumption. So in Sardinia, there's a pig called Sarda pig, and they, in Ikaria, they have these feasts where they eat tons of meat. In Japan, they eat lots of pork. It's one of their most favorite dishes. And there was a study we were actually talking about before the podcast where they looked at longevity in the Okinawans in Japan, and they did not find a single centenarian in the vegans or vegetarians. So to suggest that plant-based leads to longevity isn't really supported. And then Loma Linda is perhaps the only blue zone, quote unquote, where there is a significant plant-based diet as the ethos, but that's because the Seventh-day Adventists are there and it's a religious adherence to that. And if you look at Loma Lindens, we don't have great studies, but the studies we do have suggest that in the vegans and the vegetarians in Loma Linda, the fertility is quite compromised in terms of sperm motility and sperm numbers when people don't eat animal products. And that could be an excess of pesticides on the vegetables, but I think it's probably also an absence of the critical meat-based nutrients that are essential for sperm development, and male fertility was what they studied specifically. Things like zinc. There's not a lot of bioavailable zinc in plant foods. So I just wanted to color in a little bit of what you were saying, because those are 2 really important points.
And I want to circle back to the topic, the question that I asked you.
Yeah.
But this just really speaks to, again, the diversity of humans and human diets and inputs, but also the stuff that we'll leave out, like the story with, if we're talking about in Japan, for example,
right,
leaving out the pork because that's a bad word to certain nutritional, dogma.
Yeah.
But in reality, again, we have to be open and understand that it's very diverse. And humans can be successful doing a lot of things.
That's true.
The question, ultimately, you said this earlier, and I want to reiterate this. You had the audacity to say, if you're thriving, hey, good for you. Keep at it, right? So whether it's broccoli, whether it's Brussels sprouts, whatever the case might be. So because that's the thing that's going to come up, is that there are people who are thriving doing a vegan protocol. And we can frame things how we want to, but the reality is that thing exists. And the vast majority of humans that are doing really well, and again, just getting in connection with, your time with these cultures who are living like in this indigenous lifestyle, they're omnivores with a tilt towards carnivorous framework, right?
Animal foods, yeah.
But again, still omnivores.
Yeah.
And we want to keep ourselves open to, on that spectrum, where can we thrive?
Yeah.
Where can we thrive? And that comes from nutrient-dense foods, as you've talked about with these organs, and, high-quality sources of, various fruits and things like that. And so I love this. Now, getting back to that, these are real foods. Real foods humans have eaten for a long time. Now we have dietary recommendations. You know, like this is kind of like the thing that's being spread out now. I went to a conventional university, I had a nutritional science class, and I was taught the food pyramid. And the question has to be, who funded this? Like, who actually put this stuff together? Because we become parrots. We start parroting off what we learned in school. I paid for this education. I'm just here to help people. But seeing people following this and not being well. Today we have another thing that's come out from Tufts University that has where we had before, again, real whole foods, whatever that variety looks like on that spectrum. And they're saying frosted mini wheats are a healthier choice than, say, eggs.
Yeah.
Let's talk about it.
It's crazy, dude. So did you know that in the nutrition guidelines for 2020 to 2025, which are the ones we're working with right now from the United States government, there were 20 people on that committee, and 19 of the 20 had ties to industry and pharmaceuticals. So like they undisclosed, we're not going to really, this isn't a big deal. 95% of people on the food guidelines committee for the United States, and you and I are more in the weeds. We don't really care about what they're going to make food guidelines for, but that's what makes school lunches. That's what kids are taught in school. That's what, that's what's supported by food stamps and WIC programs. And so this is a big deal, what comes out of it. And 19 out of 20 people had industry ties. And most of the industry ties are to things like ILSI, which is the International Life Sciences Institute, which is basically the lobbying arm of junk food. Pepsi, Kraft, McDonald's, these companies are part of ILSI, and they pay so much money to this company, this lobbying thing, to put representatives in Congress and, don't step on our toes with this law or that law, or you don't want to change labeling like this because it'll affect our sales. So the ILSI, I think, was one of the major funders, the major ties to people with these guidelines. And it's going to happen again for 25 to 30, or the 2025 to 2030 guidelines, which will be out in a few years. It's going to happen again all over. And so the Tufts Food Compass study was, I think it took them 3 years to come up with this like ingenious, I'm saying that facetiously, ingenious scoring system. Who knows how much funding they got from the NIH, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And basically it was a scoring system that was just, I was thinking about this. It was just based on negatives. I think that to get a high score, you just had to not have anything negative about your food. And so the negatives were things like saturated fat. Well, okay. The negatives were things like cholesterol. So an egg scores low because it has cholesterol in it. And frosted mini wheats or Cheerios score really high because they don't have those things. When there's no positive accounting in the food compass that I'm aware of, there might be, but it doesn't seem like it based on the food rankings for micronutrients. There's nothing that says, hey, if you have more choline in this, which we know is as part of phosphatidylcholine in every cell membrane in your body, a building block of acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter, essential for optimal human mental performance. If you have more choline, then you're going to score higher. Well, there's no choline in frosted mini wheats. There's no choline in Honey Nut Cheerios or any of these foods or Pop-Tarts. There's no choline in microwave popcorn, but eggs have choline. And meat has choline, but because eggs and meat have saturated fat and cholesterol, they're at the bottom of the scoring. And we talked about this a lot. And I think you talked about it. A bunch of people in the health space were talking about it. And there was some pushback. People saying the Tufts Food Compass guidelines were not meant to be compared across food groups. So the Tufts did it by food group. They said like, okay, of all the fruits, we're going to rank them, this is the best fruit. Of all the meats, we're going to rank them, this is the best meat. But in every group, they gave a rating on the scale of 1 to 100. And they clearly said that if the rating was above 70, the food was to be prioritized. Between 30 and 60 was to be moderated or eaten in moderation. And under 30 was to be minimized. And so when red meat gets a score of 30 and frosted mini wheats get a score of, I'm blanking, I think it's 86, how is that not saying that you should prioritize frosted mini wheats and eat less red meat? And there's no appreciation for heme iron, B12, vitamin K2, choline, creatine, all these foods that are in red meat, all these nutrients that are in red meat, that you're not going to get in any processed food. So when you really dig, what you find is that, again, who funded the food compass? Pepsi, General Mills, Kraft. Oh, no surprise here. And unfortunately, the main guy at Tufts in charge of this is a physician who's also one of the co-chairs of the 2022 White House Conference on Nutrition and is almost certainly going to be involved in the next set of nutrition guidelines for 2025 to 2030. So it's kind of this I mean, it goes deep. I don't think nutrition changes are ever going to come top down. We're never going to get government regulation that actually realizes that red meat is valuable for humans, or that is honest about the fact that red meat is not inflammatory, or tells us about studies that show that replacing grains, whole grains in the diet with 8 ounces of lean red meat led to decreased CRP, led to decreased inflammation and decreased insulin resistance in humans. You're never going to see that on CNN. They're never going to talk about that at the White House Conference on Nutrition because it's not compatible with their paradigm. It's kind of like so many other things we're seeing now. It's just the food has become politicized. And unless you're on the right side of the aisle, and I think it's probably for a couple of reasons that get very, very labyrinthine to unravel, but because red meat is connected with cows and cows are connected incorrectly with climate change, red meat can't possibly be good for humans, or because saturated fat in cows raises LDL. And we know that, I'm saying this again facetiously, we know that LDL causes heart disease. Saturated fat can't be good for humans. And they're all these things that are built on a house of cards. If you really look at the data regarding LDL cholesterol and heart disease, it's completely flawed. And what we see is that, when you give people more saturated fat in animal foods, their LDL might go up a little bit, but their oxidized LDL and their Lp(a), which are much better predictors of cardiovascular disease, go down. And when you do the reverse, when you give people seed oils that Harvard University claims are healthier than saturated fats, Harvard urges people to eat seed oils like canola or soybean. They might also put in their olive oil, which is probably way better than a canola oil or a seed oil, but still has issues. But Harvard is telling people to eat seed oils. And so when they're telling people to eat seed oils, they might see a little lowering of the LDL, but Harvard is not going to tell you that your oxidized LDL and your Lp(a), which are indicators of how much of that fragile, LDL lipoprotein is getting oxidized. And that's really a strong precursor. That's a much better predictor of cardiovascular disease, because we know, I'm getting kind of technical here, we know that in the subintimal space, in the endothelium of a blood vessel, a macrophage comes into contact with an LDL particle, and that LDL particle is not oxidized, that macrophage just keeps on swimming and says, I don't need that. I don't want to eat that. But if an oxidized LDL particle ends up in front of a macrophage, it triggers a scavenger receptor, and that macrophage engulfs the LDL particle, and that's the beginning of an atherosclerotic plaque. It's called a fatty streak, or a foam cell leading to a fatty streak. So direct precursors to atherosclerosis are promoted by seed oils, but because of overarching paradigms and dogma that these institutions can't get around, because if LDL cholesterol doesn't lead directly to atherosclerosis, then we have a major problem with a multi-billion-dollar statin industry, right? So it's all tied together. It's all just this house of cards, and they can't possibly admit that something that raises LDL might be good for you, like saturated fat, when we know that stearic acid is an 18-carbon saturated fat that seems to lead to all sorts of health benefits for humans and occurs primarily in animal foods.
We'll just throw one study up of the many. We'll throw up this study here that people can see. Folks taking a statin have about a 30% increased incidence of developing diabetes, for example. There's just one. All right. We've done master classes on statins and on LDL, all manner of cholesterol, with Dr. Johnny Bowden, is one of the greats in this kind of conversation. But I'm on a mission to change some of the derogatory terms we attach to natural, normal human compounds, like LDL being bad. You're the bad cholesterol. Humans make it. It's an incredibly important aspect of human health and the communication of ourselves. Now, can there be problems that occur? Yes. But the biggest contributor to these problems, because again, Hadza don't have this issue, is our diet change, is devolution to eating predominantly ultra-processed foods. And the biggest thing, the most glaring thing that I think we all can just put our big boy pants and big girl pants on and just come to a collective agreement, which is canola oil is an ultra-processed food in every sense of the word. Frosted Mini Wheats are an ultra-processed food. Cheerios are an ultra-processed food. If these things are making up or being promoted by our most prestigious, seemingly most prestigious institutes of health, as these are foods that humans should be consuming, there's a serious, serious problem. And lots of bodies are getting paid off of our ignorance.
Something's going on.
Listen, man, this has been amazing. Obviously, we could talk for hours, man. You're one of the most insightful people that I know in this space, and I just appreciate you for the work that you're doing and for being so freaking just on it, like always staying on top of the data and standing up for people, empowering people, you know, in a world where obviously that can be shunned, you know. And I know that you went through a whole thing. You hit me up when it happened, when you were sharing so much information, and like literally like, here, you just like, look at this journal. This is saying, you know, in regards to all this stuff that happened with COVID, you were just sharing a bunch of published data, but getting the censorship tag here, there, and getting knocked off of these platforms. And you came back with ferocity. You have now over 1 million followers on Instagram in like months. And it's so incredible to see, because the thing is, empowerment will find a way. You are a great example of like, seriously, if people want to, you know, if anybody's trying to mess up your mission, find a way. Don't give up. Be creative. And that's what you did, man. And again, I appreciate you so much. Truly, like, I know a lot of people don't get it, but I get it, man. I know how much work you've put in.
Thanks so much, man. It's an honor to be here. I think it's just, you know, trying to just create content that brings people value and make them curious, trying to be undeniable and connect the dots. I'm super grateful to get to do this work. I never thought I'd be doing this when I went to medical school, and now I've got like the best job ever. I get to do creative things and talk to awesome people like you, and yeah, hopefully make people super curious.
Hey, if you like this video, make sure to check out this video right here.
So just to specify, vegetable oil is not coming from peas and carrots. It's coming from seeds, actually. So some people call it seed oil. And there's 8 of them that I recommend everyone just get out of their diet.